So thank you all for joining us today. Thank you for being here. This is the second part to our listening session, and we just appreciate all of the funders and all the BIPOC leaders that have joined us. My name is Tanya Hazelup, and I'm with Journey Bees Village. And co-creators for today's session is Ms. Joy Williams, who is our wonderful lead for the BIPOC group, and Ms. Magali Vicente. So thank you so much for joining us. Also, I would like to give a special thanks to Ms. Chanel Thompson for taking time to coordinate efforts to bring funders together on today. So thank you so much, Chanel, for doing that. And we are going to get into the meeting today. I'm going to hand it off to Joy, but right before we do that, I just want us to take a pause for a minute. And during this pause, you may say a little prayer, take a moment of silence, and then Ms. Joy is going to lead us into a beautiful song selection, and then we'll get right into the meeting. So thank you.
Thank you, Tanya. Just as an opening, we want this to be a very deeply felt experience for everyone. So just like Tanya said, we thank you for joining, and we also just speak over this meeting for it to be a positive experience. And so this song is a song that I actually sang yesterday at the commissioners meeting that just kind of holds up part of the story that I'll circle back to at the end. And I highlighted it in case you know it and you would like to join in, and I invite you to do that. Farther along, we'll know all about it. Farther along, we'll understand why. Cheer up, my brother, live in the sunshine. We'll understand it all by and by. Part of the work that we do within this BIPOC space comes from a trauma-informed lens. And so being able to pull songs from our heritage is one of the reasons why we are able to come together over hard topics, topics that people don't often speak about. And that is why our gratitude is so overwhelming for you all for being here. I would like to move through some of the hardship of how we even got to this space. And part one, just like Tanya mentioned, that actually preceded a group of meetings that BIPOC leaders had since May of last year up into the November meeting. And the start of the BIPOC leaders, we started in May because we decided that we wanted to continue on and coming together, convening together to try to figure out how do we do this inclusive economy? And how do we do it in a way that honors BIPOC leaders, their hard work that they do in the community, the difficulties that they experience, not only in the area of philanthropy when it comes to funding 501c3 organizations, but just in daily life, from police brutality to the criminal system, to the grocery stores, to racial profiling. These are experiences that under our racial constructs are felt very heavily, disproportionately within communities. And so when we look at community leaders wanting to change the very fabric and the very experiences of what happens, philanthropy is a big part of how that gets to happen. And so even preceding those meetings, we in part one described how we were a part, this BIPOC was a part of a white-led organization here in Forsyth County. And from that white-led organization, it was decided that there needed to be a split because the deeper equity work that the BIPOC leaders really thought needed to happen under that construct wasn't something that could really be indulged in at that moment by the white-led organizations and with the BIPOC leaders. There wasn't that synergy and that understanding of the importance of it. And so this is what led us to this meeting. And this is what was very important as one of the many different topics that the BIPOC leaders had. It just wasn't about philanthropy, but it was also about how do we as BIPOC leaders show up in the community, and how do we also perpetuate the same racist construct in the same oppressive cycle? So how do we start to look at ourselves and what we do in the community as well as what's happening externally? How do we also look at grant writing? So there were topics that BIPOC leaders wanted to learn more about grant writing and how to grow a budget. So some of the BIPOC leaders actually had what people will say the minimum 500,000 in their budget, but they wanted to grow to 1 million to 1.2 million so that they could be leaders in the community, to be a funnel of millions of dollars or other resources for other smaller grassroots-led organizations. And so this BIPOC group decided that we as leaders wanted to move forward in this. And so again, we thank you for the philanthropists that decided to come and to be a part of this conversation. So with that, let me also frame a kind of what today would look like again. So we will break up into different sections in which the philanthropists had a chance to look at the questions that the BIPOC leaders came together. And that was at the request of part one. At the end of part one, the philanthropists that attended listened to what we had to say. And I will say also that when I mention about moving through hardship, it's taking the specific examples, but then not letting the specifics bog us down over what that was, but taking a larger view of what that represents and then handling the matters on a larger view, because that really is the fabric in which we want to change. And so from part one, the philanthropists listened to what we had to say, and the response was, but did you know this is what we're doing within our philanthropy organization? And so that's how we arrived here, is to be able to hear some of those specificities of what is happening on the philanthropist side and what is happening in a way that can be in conversation. So those specific examples that BIPOC leaders look at and say, that's odd, or that feels a little inequitable. We can begin to have conversations about how to restructure the structure that binds us in this this hard place of tension. And so from a trauma-informed lens, that is often considered structural violence. And so many of you might have heard that term before, and that is what this conversation hopefully will lead us into. Is how do we take this piece of what we're doing in the community to change this whole big white supremacist racial structure, which I believe that you showed up here today because you're a part of that work. And so this conversation today will help bridge the gap of what BIPOC leaders' perspective is, what philanthropy perspectives are, to some extent, because we can't speak for everyone in those two spaces, but this is going to start a conversation that hopefully will lead into a co-collaborative conversation that we'll speak about at the end. So Magali, as Tanya said, will moderate the question and answer from the philanthropist. So we broke it up into two big sections. It may not take all the philanthropists all that amount of time. So if there's any time left over, we'll go directly into the Q&A in which Magali will moderate. And then we'll end hopefully with some next steps that we all could help co-create. And by co-create, I know that's that term can be understood in many different ways, but because of the limited amount of time, the choices that we have to help co-create may be limited, but the hope is that we will reach a point in which we will have more of a blank canvas for those who want to engage in that conversation to really kind of figure out what that painting looks like. So with that, are there any questions from anyone here of what I just shared so far? Magali or Tanya, would you add anything?
I don't have anything to add. I just need clarity for something you just said. You said I'm moderating the conversation. Is that accurate?
Just the Q&A. Oh. Just what we talked about. Yeah.
I don't have anything to add.
Okay. Good. Fantastic. Well, then I'm going to go straight into the interjections with the philanthropist. So thank you again, philanthropists. And I would ask, I would ask for if there is a group, and I know that there are several members of one philanthropy organization that are attending, and that pleases us so much. So I would just ask if one person would actually end the introductions of everyone in the group just with the mission and vision, but if each person will introduce your name and title, and then that one person, that one representative can introduce your name and title, and then the mission and vision of the philanthropist group. And how about we start with the Winston Salem Foundation? Is that okay?
Hi, I'm Anna Brewer, and I'm the grants manager at the Winston Salem Foundation.
Good morning. I almost said good afternoon. Not there yet. Good morning, everyone. I'm Andrea Hulligan. I also go by Dree, and I work with our strategic initiatives at the Winston Salem Foundation. It's good to be here.
Good morning. I'm Shamika Stark, and I also work with the strategic initiatives at the Winston Salem Foundation. Glad to be here.
Good morning, everyone. I'm April Durr. I also work at the Winston Salem Foundation on the community grants team. And I guess since I'm last, I'll share. So the mission of the foundation is to inspire giving and link resources to action, strengthening Forsyth County now and forever. And we are a community foundation. Thanks, Joy.
Yes, thank you, April. And I'll just add, and thank you, Magali, for the reminder. Is there anything that you want EDs to know, April, since you're the last person, about the Winston-Salem Foundation as far as the mission, vision, or strategy, since we are recording?
I couldn't hear you on that last part, Joy. I'm sorry.
No, you're fine. Is there anything else that you think BIPOC EDs might need to know about the mission, vision, or strategy that's not already on the website that would be helpful for people to know since we are recording?
Oh, sure. So the Winston-Salem Foundation has been committed to racial equity work for a number of years, and some of that work is on the website. Some of that work is not on the website because it's internal in nature. So I'll just, speak to that by saying it's a journey that we are committed to as an organization. Is that what you meant?
Yeah, that's perfect.
Okay.
Absolutely perfect. Thank you. Yeah, and let's go to ZSR, the Z. Smith Reynolds Foundation, if that's okay. With the same format, the last person, if you can introduce the mission, vision, and strategy.
I can start. Good morning, everyone. My name is Tania Duran, and I'm a program officer with the foundation. And at the foundation, I work with our state-level systemic change strategy. It's good to be here.
Morning, my name is Daryl Childers. I'm a program officer with Z. Smith Reynolds, and I focus on our community-based strategy.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Claire Bradshaw. I'm currently the first-year fellow at the foundation, and I support our various 3 different strategies under the All-Frenzy framework in a few different ways.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Nora Carr, and I'm the assistant director and relatively new, 6 months. So happy to just listen in and learn today. So, and I want to let you know ahead of time that I do have to leave a little bit early. So I'm just going to be kind of floating here in the background today. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Caitlin Burke. I'm a program officer with the foundation. I want to extend my thanks and appreciation to all of you for initiating this conversation and inviting us into it. We're really happy to be here with you today. So the mission of the Z. Smith Reynolds Foundation is improving the quality of life for all North Carolinians. My team members have mentioned the strategies, our state level systemic change strategy, which focuses on systems change, our community-based strategy, which has a couple of sort of sub-grant programs with supporting place-based initiatives, and then our exploratory visionary ideas, which is pretty broad and open. We have a couple of things that we've done with that one so far, a fellowship, the All for NC Fellowship, supporting a few young people, bringing forward bold ideas in North Carolina, our inclusive public art initiative, which is just launched a new grant program. We have 3 main commitments that we are committed to, racial equity, being a learning organization, and a commitment to our hometown, building relationships and engaging more in our hometown of Winston-Salem. Thank you so much, Joy.
That's fantastic. Thank you. I see Mayor Pro Tem Adams here. Thank you so much for making it. Would you like to introduce yourself and what the city is doing? Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Dee Dee Adams. Excuse the voice. I was in DC all last week at 2 conferences and facilitating panels and participating, so my voice is kind of shot. I'm the council member of the North Ward and the mayor pro tem of the city of Winston-Salem. I've been an elected official for 13 years. I was born and raised here in Winston-Salem. I have been pushing the city the past 13 years towards being better at being intentional about diversity, inclusion, and equity. And just like you, it's not easy work. It's always a push, not a pull. The one thing that I would like for all of you to understand is your organizations, everybody on here, has come up at one time or another by me or with the city since I've been on there. I'd like to see us work more of a partnership because government can't do everything. Everybody think we can, but we can't. And just to give you an example, I always wonder where you guys are when the clarion call goes out and we never hear from you. For example, the Weaver fire. The city stepped up. I managed and persuaded the council to give $1 million to a qualified census tracts of marginalized Black and Brown, poverty, blight, whatever community. And I live right in that mild zone. To be able to give them some relief because they live not just paycheck to paycheck, marginalized people live day to day. So the only piece I'm missing, and when I get emails from groups is to ask me if I want to listen in, be a part. I'm always up to learning how we can work better together and that our citizens can see that we care about everybody and not just somebody. The businesses, the small businesses that were affected are small, 3 to 4 employees, again, Black and Brown. They had to close down for 4 days and they are still, reeling from COVID of 2 years. So when a small business has to lose revenue and income for 3 to 4 days, they never catch up. And the people that work there, they never catch up. So, I spoke with a lot of people in Washington about that. Why is it that nobody is wanting to step up to the plate and throw some money in the game and the city can match it, give it to the foundation so that these small businesses can also benefit from some much needed resources. Again, I'm here to learn because as I said before, and I'll say again, if we aren't all working together, then what are we working for? But I appreciate all of you being on this call. Thank you.
That's good. Thank you. Janelle, I would like for us to end with you, and I just want to highlight again what Tanya said about the gratitude, because and we already spoke about this, and I've shared this with you privately, but just your heart and wanting to help BIPOC leaders. And we got here today with this organization because of your heart wanting to fund what I had referenced earlier was hands-on. And at that split, even at the part one where you attended, you were so involved and you wanted to get understanding and you wanted other philanthropists to be a part of this and you wanted other BIPOC leaders to be a part of this, because part of the hard emotions is looking at those things that don't feel so good, but then being able to work through it. And so I just want to commend you for being able to step out there to do things that philanthropy doesn't often do, be able to hear from the community and the critique and still be here present, working hard to address the problem that we all want to get to, what Mayor Pro Tem talked about. So I just wanted to highlight again the gratitude that we have for you sticking in it and for doing what you do in the community and to reach a place of understanding. I know Magali and we talked about this at the beginning, is that we're hoping that this will be a positive experience for everyone and that the end is that we reach a place of understanding. And so I thank you, Magali, for speaking that over the group, even before people arrived in the space. So Chanel, please grace us with an introduction and what KBR is doing.
Good morning, and thank you again for having us, and want to say thank you to my colleagues in philanthropy for being here, for learning and listening today. My name is Chanel Thompson, and I am the Senior Program Officer of Local Impact at Reynolds Charitable Trust, where we focus on supporting the thriving North Carolina communities by working for equitable healthcare, education, and economic mobility. As a matter of how we were, KBR, because we are a trust, our funds were established with a $4 million investment of stocks from Miss, we've been in retreat for 2 days. My mind is fried. From Miss Reynolds, Miss Kate Reynolds, $4.5 million in stock investments were invested, and that's how the trust began in 1947. As per her will, 75% of her funds were to be used across the state of North Carolina to address healthy outcomes for the people in North Carolina. The other 25% was to be invested specifically in Forsyth County. At the time, it was addressed for the poor and needy. Over the years, due to strategies and conversations, we went from addressing like financial crisis to understanding how could we support families and community to keep them from experiencing crisis. So then we began making more investments into programs that could support families with economic mobility and well-being. The last 3 to 6 years, we've been working to really understand what do we need to do differently so that we can stop putting food in book bags and go back to putting books in book bags? How do we get to the place that we don't have to continue to give people medicine, but we can understand what are the disparities that continue to plague Black and Brown communities? And so the work that we're really trying to do now is how do we get to system-wide change? And so that includes first looking at this from an equity lens. How does race, place, and location impact outcomes for individuals? How do we support the capacity of grassroots organizations while also honoring the work that larger institutions have continued to do, but to ensure that we are bringing people with lived experience and people who are on the ground doing the work into this work and creating a space that they can co-work together. Our work looks like mapping out and planning, how do we get to systems change? And then we move into what are some really unique strategic implementations that we might be able to do over 3 to 5 years and give organizations the opportunity to try a pilot program and get to sustainability, and that the trust will continue to focus on issues and areas that help to make organizations continue to address systems change. So again, thank you all for being here, and that's all.
Okay, thank you. Are there any other philanthropists? I know Velvet Bryant, you have joined us. Thank you so much. So I'll let you speak, and then if there's any other philanthropists on the call, please follow.
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Velvet Bryant. I am the Carolinas Regional Program Officer with Assets Funders Network. And so Asset Funders Network, or AFN, is a funder membership organization, and we work with funders who are committed to advancing equitable wealth building and economic mobility. We work across several issues with our members. So we take an explicit focus around asset building. And within that, there's 7 pillars that ground our work. One is around business ownership and supporting entrepreneurs, specifically entrepreneurs of color. We have a number of members who are working in the realm of education, employment and income, financial health, and the importance of having access to safe and affordable financial products and services. We have a number of funders focused on wealth and the specific connection between health and wealth, as well as the impact of the social determinants on health and the financial impact that that causes. We have some members who are working on housing and housing stability. And then within that, we have a number of members who are working to address the wealth gap, both the racial wealth gap and or the gender wealth gap. So I appreciate the invitation to join you all today. I will say, in terms of the question of what we want BIPOC leaders in the nonprofit sector to know is, for us, we believe that nonprofits are critical to the work of our funders. And so we're also building a platform called Realizing Economic Justice. And that is our commitment to help confront racial bias within philanthropy, and specifically asset building philanthropy. So that's another body of work that we're doing in partnership with our members, both regional and national, as well as nonprofits. So I appreciate the opportunity to join you all today.
That is fantastic. Thank you. Are there any other philanthropists before we move into section 1?
Good morning, Joy.
Good morning.
I'll add just a little bit more, Joy, on behalf of the foundation. I know April was our last person, but we work in 2 different areas. And so I just wanted to briefly kind of recap the initiatives for anyone who may be on the call or listening later. And so as a part of the strategic initiatives, I work with the Black Philanthropy Initiative, the Women's Fund of Winston-Salem, and YGA. And so BPI in particular makes grants to local programs and initiatives that are working to strengthen Black communities locally. And so they offer 3 different grant programs. That would be our Advancing Equity and Education grants, which will be announcing likely in April, sometime this spring. And then we also offer the Building Inclusive Economy grants, which was founded last year in the fall. And so we'll be announcing that again this fall. And then our impact grants as well, which are were specifically designed for smaller organizations to have access to funding, and also wanting to provide a way for smaller Black-led organizations in particular to be more easily access funding. And so for that particular grant program, they only need to submit a short video briefly describing what project or programming they're wanting to implement. For the Women's Fund, it's a slightly different model. Their focus is on engaging our community to build economic security for women and girls. And so they have a membership model where hundreds of women each year collectively give their dollars and then also vote on which nonprofits will receive funding that year. And the grant making typically supports programming and nonprofits that provide tools or resources for women and girls in our community. And then our final strategic initiative is a little bit different. It's our YGA, or Youth Grantmakers in Action. And so they're a little different from the other 2 in that it runs more of like a program. And so there are about 20 to 25 youth from various local high schools in Forsyth County here, and they come together about once a month each year, and they actually create their own grant making program that supports other youth-led groups here in Forsyth County. And usually YGA will spend about $2,500 to maybe $7,000 on other youth-led projects here locally in Forsyth County. And so just wanted to provide that brief kind of overview for you all and the different initiatives.
Yeah, that's excellent. Thank you. And
You're
with
welcome.
that, I'm going to go straight into just reading the next questions with that will hold section 1. And then I'll just step back and let the philanthropist just speak up to it. And then at about 10:45, 10:50, if we're still talking, I'll pause in to see if
Hey, Joy, you're breaking up just a bit. I don't know if you can hear me.
I can hear you. Is this a little bit better?
Joy, you're breaking up.
I don't know what to do.
What I'll do, Joy, what I'll do is I'll ask the question.
Okay.
Just to make sure everybody gets the question, and then by that time, hopefully your service is back and you can jump in.
Thank you.
Okay. So the first set of questions that we have for the philanthropists to think through, and you all can respond just freely and openly to whichever question, to all of the questions. Again, reminding you that this is a learning experience and a listening moment for the BIPOC leaders. So just, you know, we may not have much of a response to what you're saying because we are listening and learning. Does that make sense? Okay, so the first set of questions, and we'll try to maybe commit maybe 20 minutes to this conversation. What are the legal parameters that make it difficult to fund BIPOC leaders or small budget grassroots nonprofits? So that's question one. Question two, and I'll put this in the chat in a second. What philanthropic rules have continued the exclusion of BIPOC organizations that you are working to undo? And what are potential barriers you may face in funding traditionally marginalized organizations? And I'll give you a moment to think about those as we drop it in the chat. And then anyone can feel free to unmute yourself and just start to respond to these questions.
I'm happy to get us started with the C. Smith Reynolds crew. And I think we're going to kind of touch on all three of those questions to some extent. There are actually very few formal legal barriers that prevent us from funding organizations. A lot of it has to do with assumptions, mental models, and practices, informal rules that we have, you know, I say we, but that sort of have been established through the philanthropy that we continue to perpetuate, that we recognize these assumptions and practices, and we are working to make them explicit so that we can disrupt them. But so we're going to share a lot of this with you all, and also as we go round robin with my team, we'll say a little bit more about the strategies that we use to help you understand exempt organization IRS. We do have a policy for supporting organizations through a fiscal sponsor, where there's a fiscal sponsor that helps kind of manage the money for an organization if it's not a 501c3 working to, you know, get its 501c3, or is a collection of individuals. That has its own racial equity implications, because our policy is that the fiscal sponsor is the authority of the money. They're in charge of the money. So if you are actually trying to give power and resources to a BIPOC-led organization, but their money is actually controlled by another organization, even if that is a really good partner with a very mission-aligned partner, they still are controlling the money. So we continue to examine our fiscal sponsorship policy and how we are unintentionally, and even in some ways intentionally, perpetuating not moving funds to BIPOC-led organizations. And I'll say too that our legal counsel is very conservative when it comes to looking at these fiscal sponsorship policies. Our trustees are very risk averse, because if the contract or the agreement is breached, then the foundation takes on what's called expenditure responsibility. So we are responsible for being accountable that the funds are used the way we intended them to be used. and the foundation does not desire to take on that responsibility. So our fiscal sponsorship policies are looked at with a fine-tooth comb. So that, again, we're trying to better understand what are the implications of these policies. The final thing is the final kind of legal piece, or maybe two more slightly legal pieces, are about the amount that the foundation, and this is for all philanthropy, has to pay out of the trust funds. We are required to pay out a minimum of 5% of the funds that we have, but the funds were set up to be in perpetuity, so they must continue to grow over time. And so in essence, that 5%, instead of becoming a minimum, has become the target. And there are tax laws that suggest that we should not pay out more than 5%. So these funds, as the world market is, doing extremely well and people are hurt, the foundation continues to grow the funds, and yet we are not paying out more of the money to organizations. Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem, for that. I felt that's my face too. The final thing is that we have the bylaws are set up such that the trustees have control over a lot of the money. We have very little staff discretionary funds. So when something like the Weaver fire happens, we have some discretionary funds to be able to support the community in responding to that, but the majority of the funds of that the foundation has are controlled by the trustees. So there's a process, there are strategies, there are questions about alignment, and I think that starts to get into some of those assumptions and informal rules about how money is spent. So I'm going to open it up to Tanya to talk a little bit about that.
Thank you, Caitlin. So as Caitlin was mentioning earlier, so we have found that internally at CSR, it has been very helpful for us to, I'm talking about some staff, and particularly staff that has been very embedded in our internal racial equity process, to challenge assumptions that have been unchallenged for a long time, make them explicit, just so we understand that this is not human nature. These are assumptions that are in specific bodies, that are in specific identities. So I'm going to focus on some of the assumptions that we have found that happens usually. I speak in CSR, but I'm assuming in other philanthropic organizations as well. So one of our major strategies is called state-level systemic change strategy. And in that strategy, we basically fund, in theory, local, regional, and statewide groups, focusing on different issues, anything from strengthening democracy, social and economic justice, climate and environmental justice issues, education. So anyway, a lot of different issues. That strategy also prioritizes approaches that the foundation assume aligns more squarely with state-level systemic change, and that includes litigation, policy change, advocacy, organizing, applied research. And also, as part of the strategy, the foundation has named some specific constituencies or communities as priority, including BIPOC communities, youth, LGBTQ communities, and women. So I say that because that's that strategy has been like kind of named, but when you implement the strategy, then you start realizing that there's some assumptions that might be preventing BIPOC-led grassroots groups that are centering community to get funding. So one of the assumptions is from even in the name, because state-level systemic change often excludes groups that are working more locally or regionally, that they might not see themselves as statewide or have statewide implications. So a lot of the groups, the BIPOC-led groups, tend to be that we have in our docket or we have talked to, tend to be focused more local and regional. But what sometimes the foundation or trustees don't tend to understand is that a lot of BIPOC-led groups don't tend to work in this very centralized top-down manner. It's more decentralized, interconnected, rooted in community. And so that's one of the first assumptions that we were putting, we were making explicit, that because what we ended up seeing with that strategy is that typically white-led statewide groups ended up having most of the funds. And you would have a little bit of BIPOC-led groups with some funding, but those BIPOC-led groups that got funding tended to be statewide at the detriment of other groups that are working more locally or regionally. So that was the first assumption, is the issue of geographic scope that needs to be interrogated. The second one was about what do we mean when we mean systemic change? So this strategy has typically prioritized approaches such as litigation and policy change that had tended to be more that had tended to be more carried out by white-led groups that are statewide. So that's another thing that some of us as staff and community members have been interrogating internally, that you cannot prioritize these. A lot of, quite frankly, a lot of time what ends up happening, not everybody, but some of these groups that are statewide and focusing on this rely heavily on that work, direct work of BIPOC-led organizations on the ground, and claiming credit by proximity to this work. So that's something that we have also lifted up, that you cannot assume just because a group says they're statewide that they're really being accountable to communities at statewide level. I mean, it's impossible to have that level of rootedness if you are statewide. So therefore, the need to really focus our funding in more local, regional groups that are accountable to communities. The other piece is that this strategy has deprioritized direct services. Our communities, Black and Brown communities, cannot afford, like, you have to fund direct service. And at the same time, a lot of these BIPOC-led groups don't have the option. That's why they're at the cutting edge of work, because they are very crafty and sophisticated in combining direct services with organizing and legal advocacy in a very layered way. And that's something that sometimes is overlooked. And the other assumption that we have been interrogating is this notion of capacity. So usually the assumption is that some groups need to have certain capacity to be funded. So in theory, they could have an impact on systemic change issues. Without recognizing the historic disinvestment that has happened in BIPOC communities. I mean, it's not coincidence that a lot of our groups, organizations don't have the flexibility or the resources if they have been disinvested in for the longest time. So this issue of like capacity brings more capacity that needs to be also disrupted. And that's something that we have been trying to talk about internally and interrogate. And before I move, I pass it to Claire. Also, the notion of philanthropy is very important to put it in a historical perspective. You know, this money comes from injustices. So it's also important as we think about philanthropy to think about when we share the funds or when there's grant making, to get out of the framework of charity, of top down. It's more of a framework of like, how can we give back the money to the communities because of their labor? This money has been accrued in the first place. So anyway, so I just think it's just very important to have these conversations in a very explicit way. Otherwise, all these very dire issues that our communities are experiencing, we won't get funding them at the level that they require, especially in this time when so many intersecting crises are affecting our communities. We need to start thinking about how do we fund at that level. So I'm going to pass it on to Claire, but the bottom line is for us, I think it's very important to share with you the assumptions, because sometimes the notion is how can BIPOC-led groups feed into the strategies? But there's the other piece is how can philanthropy and CSR challenge the strategies that make it impossible for groups to be seen as a fit if we're not challenging that. So that is our work internally as staff and also communities like yours to make philanthropy also accountable. And I'll turn it to Claire for the next part.
Absolutely. And thank you, Tanya. And so just to add on to what Tanya was sharing and Caitlin about some of like the informal rules or mindsets that can, pose barriers and really hold back philanthropy from, thinking radically and reimagining the world and how we can interact with community. I think a big part of that is also the ways in which, and Tanya and Caitlin already mentioned this, but lifting up the ways that white supremacy is so ingrained in not only individual thinking and mindsets, but also in collective mindsets when it comes to making decisions in philanthropy in terms of grant making. And a big part of that is, the white supremacy characteristic that prioritizes quantity over quality. So that is often something that, that we have noticed in terms of our internal grant making processes is evaluating and prioritizing the quantity of people impacted by a certain project or by a certain organization and looking at that rather than the quality of impact and the depth of relationship and the depth and longevity and proximity to the community being served by an organization. And so I think something that in the internal interrogation of our mindsets that Tanya and Caitlin lifted up, I think that is also a really large part of that, is looking at the nuance and looking at the longevity of relationship with community over the quantity of people served, which is something that is so deeply ingrained in philanthropic decisions. And the last thing that I'll say is also, the networks of board and staff are often defined by our background, our education, our racial and ethnic identities, our lived experiences, where we grew up, in our personal areas of expertise. So, our networks and our ways of viewing the world and who we know, in organizations across the state. I think one of the biggest, strengths of at DSR being a statewide organization, serving philanthropy is the breadth of all of our relationships across the state, but a big part of that is recognizing the massive limitations that also exist there because all of our relationships are informed by those different facets of our identities that I just mentioned. And so there are numerous communities, numerous amounts of work being done on the ground that we are not tapped into as a byproduct of being limited by our networks because of the things that I just mentioned. So the way that these networks grow can often limit relationships. Our ways of thinking lead to implicit bias, creeping into our grant making processes. And I think that there's a lot of potential in moving away from relying so heavily on our personal and historic relationships across the state, not to discount, the importance of relationship building and our existing relationships, but looking beyond that and really questioning who and what we know and why we know who and what we know, and questioning why don't we know who we don't know, which is a lot of whys, a lot of who's. Happy to reword that. That got a little wordy there, but the bottom line before I pass it on to my colleague Daryl is that philanthropy often prioritizes grass top leaders, folks that are 4-year college educated, oftentimes Ivy League educated, and deprioritizes really authentic and long-term community connections and folks with lived experiences. So I think that is something that we're really keeping top of mind and thinking about. And I'll pass it on to Daryl.
Thanks, Claire. And I'll start by saying my kids they have a teacher work day today, and so you may hear screaming or basketballs bouncing in the background. I'll apologize in advance about that. And so I think y'all can hear from Tanya and Caitlin and Claire that we're kind of an organization in transition. And I think we're looking at a lot of our internal practices and interrogating assumptions around how we make grants, how we interact with community, how we interact with our grantees, and I think we're looking at our applications and trying to understand how that may be impacting BIPOC-led organizations, looking at applications that are overburdensome, long, and looking at reporting processes in the same way that are, you know, just inaccessible for so many organizations, and questioning why we have these practices in place. And a lot of it is around sort of assumptions around due diligence and what it means to take care of this money, so to speak. And so we've been talking a lot about sort of trust-based philanthropy, and what that can mean for some of these internal practices, like communication styles, and what do our systems mean for people who are non-native English speakers. We've talked about organizations that may have less capacity and sort of their ability to just sort of navigate in these systems. And I think that a lot of those things are issues that we're looking at and issues that we have as ESR, but I would guess that most philanthropic organizations have those problems as well. And to get a little bit more specific, I think Tanya told y'all a little bit about our state level strategy. And I think it's great in a lot of ways because it's a lot of general operating support. But the priorities for our state level is that it prioritizes organizations with a stable budget, organizations that are more established, and organizations that have more capacity. And so it ends up being these large statewide organizations that are white-led, and it doesn't take into account the historic disinvestment in BIPOC-led organizations. And then on the other side, one of the grant strategies that I lead is our Community Progress Fund. And we have explicit goals related to BIPOC-led organizations for Community Progress Fund. We try to grant to at least half of our grants go to BIPOC-led organizations for a Community Progress Fund. And I think we ended up usually getting more in the 60 to 70 range. But these grants are small, so they're $20,000 to $30,000 grants, much smaller than the state level grants, and they're only for 1 to 2 years. And once an organization gets one of these grants, they can't reapply right after. They have to wait 2 years before they can reapply. And these grants for this strategy are project grants. They're not general operating support grants. So you can see sort of in the comparison between those two grant strategies, one where BIPOC-led organizations are more likely to get funded. There are there are big downsides to that grant strategy as compared to our state level strategy. So I'll end by saying that I feel like we are lifting up. I like how critical we're being about our own organization, and I think that while there's a lot of work to do, I'm really glad that we are in a place where we have staff that can look at this with a really critical eye and challenge those assumptions. And I'm glad to be here with you all, where we can learn from you all and hear what you all are thinking about, and we can take that back and do even more work to challenge these assumptions. And I'll turn it back to.
Yeah, I was just sending Joy. I just sent Joy a DM. I don't know if she feels like she's back, or you want me to.
Yeah, I think I'm back, and I'm still gonna leave a space for any philanthropists to answer section 1 before I know we're a little bit over the time, but I feel like this is where we are energy-wise is a good place to be. Would there be any other philanthropists who would like to jump in those questions that were taken in section 1? Thank you, Magali.
Sure, Joy. I'll
go ahead, Chanel.
Okay.
You go ahead, Chanel.
So I think that many of the answers, D. Smith Reynolds has probably already lifted up some. I think a couple of things I did want to speak to on behalf of KBR is, one, when we talk about the legal parameters that make it difficult to fund BIPOC leaders, thank you all for also including small grassroots nonprofits, because it would definitely be illegal for us to be saying that we were creating metrics that exclude particular groups of people. I think one of the other things that we talk about is, what are the potential barriers? One is when we are providing private funds, we are also required to do due diligence to make sure that we do no harm to the organizations that we are seeking to serve. And so from a private foundation standpoint, when we are making investments, we know that we are also creating a responsibility on smaller organizations that they have to be able to recoup in funds that amount of money within 5 years from public funded organizations. And so when we look at a budget of an organization, and let's see that in 2021, they perhaps had $25,000 that they had raised in public dollar funds. Our grants typically start at $100,000 or more. And so an organization would have to more than 3 times quadruple their fundraising efforts after receiving funds from from KBR in order to make sure that they don't lose their 501c3 status. And so we try to look at what other ways can we support an organization. That may be us using our donor advised funds, which means that we can make donations to a public funded foundation. Typically with us, it would be the Winston Salem Foundation, and then ask them to work specifically with an organization to provide some funds to them to get them up higher in their public fundraising. So that's one issue. So we always look at the tipping issue, and that is something that will come up in every grant meeting that we have. The other is also recognizing that when we work as trustees, like Smith Reynolds, the staff, they say they have very little, we have no power in how grants are being disseminated across the community. We make a recommendation to the trustees who then take that information to the lawyers to ensure that any grant that we make falls in line with the will of Ms. Reynolds, and that this money is being used in terms of how in 1947, when she said poor and needy, does the grant that we're making or proposing today fall in line with what she probably would agree with if she was still living today? And so we don't get to determine how funds are being used in community. It's our due diligence to ensure that the grants that are coming in meet the strategies of KBR, and that we are trying to also support the mission and vision of the trust. I think the other thing that I also wanted to say is when we think about what approaches are we taking to move some things around, one is I pulled some data because I wanted to know where we were, and we presented this at our retreat on yesterday. Since 2020, 45% of the grants that we've given out since 2020 have been capacity building grants. And of those grants, 74% of them are given to BIPOC-led organizations. That's $4.5 million. And so the other thing I want to note is in Forsyth County, I have about $5.6 million per year that we're able to spend locally here. So if we look at the fact that we're talking about 45% of the funding has gone to capacity building grants, that means about 36, almost 40% of all the funds that have been distributed in Forsyth County in the last 2 years have been to support organizations that need capacity building work. But in that capacity building, we still are charged to ensure that we are working with organizations that specifically address the strategies that are assigned to KBR. I think we're probably going to go into that a little bit later about what the actual strategy areas are, and I don't want to take up, okay, Joyce, okay, so we'll get to that later. And I think many of the things that have been lifted up by C. Smith Reynolds are the questions that we're all having in, internally. Most folks that are coming into philanthropy at this period in time, we're showing up for one or two reasons. One, because we believe that there needs to be a shift in how money is being disseminated in our community. And we also believe that in order for us to really get change in community, it has to be at a systems level. And how do we shift not only internally, but externally what we're doing with our money?
So Joy, is it okay?
Thank you so much. Yes,
if I go
jump
next?
in.
Thanks so much. So I'm going to start with question one and then get a little bit into barriers. And then I know my teammates in the second section are going to talk more to give some examples to illustrate kind of some of the things I'm going to lift up. And you're going to hear some common themes among, I think, all three funders here today. But The one thing that's really different for the Winston Salem Foundation compared to who you've heard from already is that we are a community foundation. So we have different legal parameters, and ours is we actually don't need to fund 501c3s. We don't have, there isn't a law that says that we have to fund 501c3s. What we can't do is fund individuals. That's the major thing. But if we don't fund a 501c3, then there has to be something called expenditure responsibility. So according to government, we have to be able to show even more so how that particular entity used those funds once the grant is over. And so, we've tried different ways of doing that, and we have grant programs currently that you don't have to have a 501c3 in order to receive a grant from us. I see some head nods because I know some of you have gotten those from BPI in particular. And so, I heard Z. Smith Reynolds saying they're looking at their fiscal sponsorship policy, and we're also doing that because we do have grant programs that ask for fiscal sponsorship, but legally we don't have to have that. So we're going to be looking at that as we continue on our journey. And so that's what I really wanted to focus on in this section, though, is our racial equity journey as a foundation. So out of the 4 colleagues or the other 3 colleagues I have on here, I've been here the longest. I've been at the foundation for 15 years in May. I know. And so, I feel like I have seen and been so much a part of the evolution of the Winston-Salem Foundation. The Winston-Salem Foundation is over 100 years old. It is the oldest foundation in North Carolina, and one of the oldest community foundations across the country. And so there's a lot of history there, right? And I will say one other thing about community foundations is that people can come and organizations can come to set up funds and use that to make their charitable donations. And we have no control over those funds at all as a staff. We have control over what we call discretionary funds, where someone says, I trust the foundation to make the decision as far as how my funds are spent. And then Shamik and I work with our initiatives, and the BPI and Women's Fund in particular use either membership dues or fundraising in order to do their grant making. And so they have discretion over those, and our volunteers decide how those funds are spent. But the majority of any community foundation across the country, they do not have control over the funds because the individual donors get to decide how those are spent. So all that to say, as far as barriers, it's a lot of what you've heard before. It's a lot of history. It's the fact of how our country was set up and how systemic racism is embedded in everything. Philanthropy is no stranger to that. And for the longest time here, I think it's really easy to just continue to do things the way you've always done them. And it really wasn't until we started going on what I call a racial equity journey. And when I say journey, there is no end. There's no end to it because of this country, the way we are set up, there is no truly anti-racist organization in this country. We can try as hard as we can and we can thrive for it and we should thrive for it, but we don't have a model. And so we have to build it as we go along, right? And so that's something I can say full-heartedly that everyone here at the Winston-Salem Foundation is committed to this journey and exploring what that means for us as a 100-plus-year-old community foundation in the South. And so a big part of what we've been doing the last 4 years is really challenging ourselves to ask questions like what you've heard from the other funders. A lot of it is questions around our processes, both internally and externally, right? And the questions are, why have we done it this way? Do we need to continue to do it this way? Has the way we've been doing it unintentionally harmed or disadvantaged certain groups? And a lot of times the answer is yes. So then we say, well, what do we need to do about that moving forward? We ask, how is race operating? How is power operating? We're doing that both internally and externally. And, I'll give one example, and then, like I said, later on, my colleagues are going to give more. But, Shamik and I work a lot with our BPI volunteers. BPI is as old as I am here, almost 15 years old. And for the longest time, what's funny is we didn't even realize that BPI and their guidelines didn't even say they explicitly are going to prioritize Black-led organizations. I think we all just assumed we're called the Black Philanthropy Initiative. Of course, that's what we're going to do. Of course, that's what people are going to think. But that wasn't the case. It wasn't the case. And so about 3 years ago is when we changed that in all of our guidelines. And guess what? That led to more than 95% of BPI's grantees being Black-led. And by the way, we defined Black-led too, because there's lots of definitions for Black-led, but we defined it to be both staff and or board, right? Because some organizations don't have staff, need to be 50% more or more Black. That's how we define Black-led. And so we've just been really working through things like that and thinking about what are we asking those we're interacting with, like many of you on this call, to show us what you're doing in community. Because in the past, we know it's been too much. It's just been too much. And so we're just really working through, and you're going to hear from, April, Anna, and Shamika about how we've been thinking through the burdensome things that we're doing and how we've been trying to work with one another here and with our colleagues on the phone here on the Zoom call to answer a lot of these questions that was talked about.
Thank you so much. Was there any other philanthropists, because I'm looking at the time, was there any other philanthropists that wanted to go into this section before we move into the, just check in with any Q&A and then move into the second section? Yay. Okay, good. I will quickly pass it to Magali to see if there are any questions that have been fielded in the chat to her or anything that has emerged.
So there aren't any explicit questions in the chat. So at this time, I want to open it to the few BIPOC leaders that did join us for this conversation specifically. Is there a burning question? Let me be clear, clarifying question. This isn't the, this session isn't for us to kind of go back and forth with our concerns. It's just more anything that you've heard so far that you may need some clarity on. So Mike, Ethan, Paula, Bill, Lucille, if you all have anything specifically, that's a question about what you've heard that you need clarity on before I ask my clarity question.
I personally do not, but I do want to thank everyone who put this session together, very informational. I do spend most of my time going and getting as much educational feedback to be able to support the organization and the marginalized communities that we support. So thank you very much.
I have a question, and this is to all the funders who are working on systemic changes, systemic solutions. In the work that you're doing so far around racial equity and grant making, have you seen any difference? Are you seeing, is your data changing in terms of the amount of grants you're given to BIPOC-led organizations?
Can I just step in here and just pause that question for a second? But we will make sure.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Magali.
I was just gonna say, can we hold that question for the second round of questions, Paula? We just want to use this round for any clarifying things from what we've heard so far so we can move into the second set of questions. Is that okay with you? Okay. Mike, I'm assuming you're good. Okay. And Bill and Lucille, I can't see y'all. Tanya, I can't see you. So there you go, Tanya. I'm assuming you're good. Okay. My only clarifying, I have two clarifying questions, and then Joy, I'll pass it back to you. I think, Claire, you were the person that mentioned this, and I just want to make sure I heard correctly. You mentioned during your piece around relationship with community over quantity of people served at one point. Were you saying that when we as BIPOC leaders think of that, the quantity of people we're serving and our relationship to the community is having a direct impact to our funding opportunities for us? Is that how I understood that comment? I don't know if she's still here, actually. There's Claire. Or anyone from ZSR if you know the answer to that question.
I'm happy to speak on that. I know Claire is outside at a coffee shop trying to make sure she has good internet access. So in case she isn't able. So no, that's not quite, it's less about a particular criteria for looking at a grant and more about a mindset. So we sometimes will hear this question of what's the impact or how many people are impacted when we are reviewing grants. We'll hear it from trustees or even from some staff looking at two different opportunities to support, say, youth kind of after school mentoring. And it's like, well, this one impacts 15 people and this one impacts 25 people. And we have to be intentional about asking, well, yes, but what is the impact? What is being provided to those 15 versus those 25? So it's more of the kind of that default of valuing quantity over quality and just looking at those numbers. We run the risk of not really understanding what's the work being done, and can you really say that just because 15 versus 5 are being impacted that one is better than the other? No. So we have to better understand what's the work being done, what are the relationships being built, how is this, what is the broader work, and not just looking at those numbers. So in my time at the foundation, I haven't seen a criteria that says we don't have the metrics that say you need this number of impact, this much of dollars moved, this many relationships built, but it can be a cultural tendency to go to that and not take the time to better understand the work being done. Does that help?
It does. Thank you so much for that, Caitlin. And I think it leads into my second clarifying comment, not question. And this I'm just putting, oh, sorry, Chanel, I see you.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, and in terms of, not to speak to Z. Smith Reynolds, but in philanthropy as a whole, that the conversation used to be around outputs, which is where there was lots of numbers. It was all about how many people, how many workshops, multiply that by some indicator, and then whoever got the highest number, you win. And impact really is about not just people, but what other things are you bringing in? So do you have the opportunity to shift policies? Are you able to create some type of call to action in community? If we're talking about tutoring, are we also talking about why children at one particular school need more tutoring than others? Well, we need to look at the number of new teachers that are coming out being sent to Title I schools versus experienced teachers, looking at all the things that really bring us to, are you really making an impact versus an outcome or output?
Thank you. And I think my clarifying comment as we move into the next section to wrap up this session is really, and this is for the leaders of the nonprofits that are with us and that will be listening later, just really remember and think about some of the words that we've heard during this part as far as what's legal, what our practice is, what's tradition, and how the BIPOC, how the foundations and funders are working through some of that stuff as we wrap up this section of the conversation. And I just wanted to name that, Joy, before I pass it back to you for food for thought for all of us later.
Thank you, Magali. Thank you for all the clarifying questions and for the clarification. And thank you, philanthropists. Verbally, I want to say thank you. So let me quickly just reorganize the last portion of our meeting. I would love for us to do a pause at 11:40 for any clarifying questions. So for any philanthropist who, I know there were two specifically who wanted to address this next section. So I will go ahead and read it. And KBR, you were one, Chanel. So I would ask if you would follow up after I finish. And then I think Caitlin, the Z. Smith Reynolds organization was also going to answer this. And if any other philanthropists would want to, feel free to jump in if there's time. So the question I put in the chat, but it's also, I'll just read it. So question 1 is, are you willing to think through alternate ways to bridge the gap between wanting to fund traditionally marginalized organizations and actually doing so in 2022 and beyond? Many of you have already answered this. And what we're looking for is to elaborate on anything that you have planned or strategies to bridge the funding disparity gap, if you are able to add anything that wasn't already shared, because you all have shared a lot already to this question. So there may not be anything to add to this. The next question is a 3-part question, and it has to do with fiscal sponsorship and collaboration. Part A, what other ways can you offer that BIPOC organizations could prove they are able to manage and operate financing funding if they continuously are being asked to funnel funds through other organizations, typically non-BIPOC led? And that has been spoken to already some. Part B is, regardless of BIPOC or non-BIPOC organizational status, have you considered the implications and impacts of telling one nonprofit to have another nonprofit legitimize them, culture of competition being created, lack of trust, delaying of execution of programs, subject to different timelines and processes, etc. Part C, consider invoking this process primarily for grassroots individual ideas, connect to a nonprofit willing to support the work the individual is doing. And now, yeah, thanks, Chanel.
Joy, I was going to say, can you clarify? I think C is where I might not. I don't know if there's a way we can reword that so I can make sure that
I can clarify, because this set of questions is coming directly from me. So to clarify part C for all of the funders, it's about the fiscal sponsor idea, the whole idea of getting someone else to legitimize you. Considering invoking that process specifically for individuals, since you can't fund individuals, versus putting it on organizations to get the access to funding. So does that help, or do you still need me to clarify?
I'll answer A and B, and maybe somebody else can hop into C.
Okay.
Okay. Okay. So I think one of the things that we're doing, and I think, that I am literally sitting in the middle of, I think the word that Joy uses often to describe this is structural violence. Of how we work within collaborations. At the Trust, we try not to use fiscal sponsorships because, well, for several reasons. One, it's not one that the trustees agree to, but we do participate in collaborations where we ask organizations, are there other nonprofit organizations that you can partner with to complete the work that you're doing? And everybody has some role or responsibility into it. And one of the things that we have really tried to get the lead grantee to understand is that we are asking you to extend to all of your partners the same grace that philanthropy gives to you. And so I think that it is, one, when we give a grant based off of what we consider to be somebody's resume. And because you have shown us that you have done this work, we put hundreds of thousands of dollars in your hand and assume that you will do the work and do it with due diligence. We don't ask grantees to submit an invoice once a month and then we pay you for the work. We don't say, well, have you done 50% of what you said you're going to do, and then we'll give you the rest of the money. And so when we fund in a collaboration, that's the same way we expect for the lead grantee to work with all other partners. And so there should not be a quarterly or a monthly type of report and then you get your work. MOU should be created amongst all of those organizations, and then they get the money to do the work that they were funded to do. So that does give, in the second part of that question, the opportunity for organizations who maybe have not had hundreds of thousands of dollars at one time to move that money forward. That gives them the credibility to say that we have managed and provided what it was we said we were going to do. They're responsible for their own bookkeeping. And then that report goes back to their lead grantee and they come together to do a final report. And so while it still is trying to make sure that we are not creating, the only reason we're not giving money directly to BIPOC organizations typically is going to be, one, they requested less than $100,000, or if they need several $100,000, their 501c3 status may be compromised if KBR were not to fund them for the next 3 to 5 years. What other funders are going to come in and match that gap for them? So hopefully that kind of clarifies, kind of what it is we're doing. I think the other thing that I've been kind of sitting in this space of is listening and trying to understand what other ways can we work around this. We have not gone back in a strategy to talk about lowering our grant amounts. But I think that that's one of the things that, we may have to consider rather than using donor advised funds for individuals that are requesting less than $100,000. Are we willing to shift how we manage money throughout the trust so that people with more capacity building grants can apply directly to us? Because for our other funders, they're providing grants of $25, $50, up to maybe $75,000, where we're starting at much higher amounts of $100,000 and moving forward. And typically we're only doing a small portion of organization's grant. So for a BIPOC organization, that $100,000 might be 70 or 80% of their total budget. And typically when we're funding, we're looking to be able to come into an organization where we're providing less than 50% of the total overall budget to make the work move forward. Let's see.
Did any of the other funders want to speak to these questions?
I wasn't sure if Chanel was done. It looked like she was still reading the questions. Was there anything else you want to add?
Yeah, Magley, I would say no at this time. I'm still not really sure about invoking.
No, that's fine. I was clarifying it for others because you said you'll speak to A and B. That's fine.
Okay, yeah. So I also realized that when Caitlin, I would love for the ZSR to go next. And just, I want to name that the Winston Salem Foundation also said they wanted to combine maybe 5. So if there was anything else you wanted to add, please do. And of course, Velvet, if you want to add in something, or Mayor Pro Tem Adams, feel free to do that. Thank you.
I just want to say that, as you can see, I got a hat on, got to run out to another meeting. Collaboration is key. With all of this money that's getting ready to come in, and it's already started, particularly the ARPA part. I know a lot of people question the process, but there has to be collaboration. We cannot continue to work individually in our own silos. This is my project, my piece. You got to figure out in order to have the greatest impact, to collaborate with others that are doing, basically, if they're not doing the same work, they're doing pieces of the work that you're putting in your application for any of this money, whether it's philanthropic groups or government. And we're seeing that if we do that, then we'll be able to make transformational change in our community. I'm not worried about Greensboro and High Point, Kernersville. I'm worried about Winston-Salem because we have the biggest population in the metro area and we have the biggest poverty, number 4 in the nation. And if we can't get that right now in this, we got 2 years, people. That's all you got right now. 2 years to make transformational change by working collaboratively to eliminate or decrease the poverty, the housing, the education, economic development, small businesses, with people that are, again, Black, brown, indigenous, Black, and other peoples of color. And I, again, am just so grateful to be a part of this conversation. I have a meeting with the city manager, and I'm going to relay this because, we want to be able to, it's hard for government to see that we just can't be government. We have to work with all of you in order for this thing to work. So as these grants and monies are coming down, the Biden administration built into it, there has to be marginalized communities, qualified census tract, poverty, people of color. It's got to be there. And if it's not anything that can transform where we are now, then you need to relook at your model. It's not saying that you're not all that, but you need to go back as a philanthropic group or a 501c3, go and revisit your mission, your strategy, and see if it's lining up with the requirements of the ARPA money and all of these other things and the city so that we can all work together towards a common goal. Because if we got 50 goals out there and none of us are able to even complete or make any of it work, then you need to narrow your focus to what you're good at and go find the other people that's good at what they do. Again, I want to thank all of you for this morning. I'm looking forward to further conversation. I will be on the call.
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem. Caitlin, I'm going to pass it to you and to your team.
I don't know that we can add too much more on the fiscal sponsorship question than what I already shared. I think, when you ask about proving that you're able to manage the funds in order to move the money, that proof for our foundation based on our legal restrictions is 501c3 status. So unless you have a 501c3, we would seek to move money through a fiscal sponsor. And that's the kind of policy that we are trying to better understand. What are the implications? There also, in terms of moving, supporting an individual, the foundation is very, very hesitant. We've had a fellowship, which I mentioned, the All for NC Fellowship. We did that for one cycle, which supported 4 young people across North Carolina who are working on projects from Wilmington bus tour that looked at kind of the history in Wilmington, to someone who was working on how do we ensure equity in the growing hemp industry in North Carolina. So we supported individuals through that, and I'll say that the trustees were extremely uncomfortable providing $100,000 to an individual with no kind of accountability, or in their mind, without that 501c3 status accountability. We also have a sabbatical program for nonprofit leaders to help support those who they're tired from the work, and we want to give them anywhere from 1 to 3 months of support for them to take time off. And then we also provide support to the organization while they are on sabbatical. So that's a program that we have. Other than that, I'm not familiar with any conversations about using a fiscal sponsorship to move money to an individual, but that's certainly something that we can talk more about as we have these conversations about the fiscal sponsorship policy. But on the other question about, are we willing to think through alternate ways to actually walk the walk that we're talking about? Yes, we are. I think the way we all have been presenting these assumptions and practices that we've talked about today are an example of how we are trying to name these assumptions explicitly and have internal conversations about what does it mean. To Paula's question about data, we have been starting to collect data. I think Tanya could talk more about our practices around data. And then Daryl could talk a little bit about our capacity building efforts to help kind of grow the capacity and infrastructure intentionally among BIPOC-led organizations. Yeah, so I'll stop there and turn it over to my team.
If there's anyone else from DSR who wanted to comment on any of those sections of that question, if not, I do want to go back to the Winston Salem Foundation to see if there was anything else you wanted to add on question 5, and then any other, Velvet, if you wanted to hop in. Daryl, I saw your mic off, so go for it.
Yeah, I was going to say that we are working on developing a capacity building program. And in a lot of ways, the general operating support that ZSR gives out already, can be seen as capacity building funding. But we're looking to develop a program that would more intentionally build capacity. I'll say that for now, those funds would only go to current grantees, which presents barriers when it comes to organizations that haven't been able to get in the door to ZSR. And then, and maybe the last thing I'll say, and I'll speak, I don't like to generalize or speak so broadly, but I think it's the only way I can really talk about this. But I think for a lot of foundations, there is a real disconnect between staff and board of directors. I think that there's some progress happening at foundations where they're hiring some folks who are maybe more progressive in their thinking when it comes to racial equity and how they interact with community organizations and how they think about grant making. But I think for a lot of organizations, the boards are a bit behind where staff are, and so there's some tension there. I just want to raise that up. I think that's important context.
Can I add something really quick? Yes, and regarding alternate weights, one of the things that we have explored to do, although we haven't done it that as much as it needs to be, is the issue of leveraging. So foundations have connections with other foundations. So a role that philanthropy can play, and ZSI, some of us have tried to play, is organizing other funders to be able to have in the radar BIPOC-led grassroots organizations that wouldn't be in the radar otherwise. So we organize something called funder collaboratives. So we try to be very present in some of those to make sure that different funders put money in a collective pool, and maybe they don't have in their own docket very explicit BIPOC-led funding, but by being in these collaboratives, then they start realizing, the things that they may be missing in terms of investment. So I think there's a role for philanthropy too, to do the work in amplifying the amount of resources that go to communities as well. And the other piece is, I've seen a lot of organizations, particularly that happens a lot with white-led organizations. They contact us and they contact, hey, can you connect me with this other funder? And I've been doing that some of us have been doing that the other way and connecting very proactively BIPOC-led organizations to other funders, so they can have, it's not just on their own shoulders to do that fundraising, it's also on us as philanthropic organizations as well. So I think in alternative ways, it's also assuming that additional role of expanding the amount of resources available to communities and making those connections. I just wanted to add that piece.
Thank you, Joy. I'm happy to chime in here. Appreciate everything that everyone has shared, and to respect everyone's time, I don't want to repeat anything that's already been said. I'll just say that at the Winston Salem Foundation, a lot of the things colleagues at the other foundations have shared, we are also, talking about and doing, so I won't repeat any of that. To add some other points to the conversation that we weren't able to share so far in the dialogue, I can just add a few pieces about our work and maybe help to clarify a couple of things. So in community grants, you heard earlier from Dre and Shamika about our strategic initiatives grants, but at the Community Foundation, we also have community grants. And so there are 3 specific areas that we fund through our community grant making. And all of these, of course, are outlined on our website and our e-news. And just want to share that we really do take the feedback that we're getting, both from the nonprofit community that's applying for funds and from feedback of our colleagues and our volunteers who serve on our board and our grant making subcommittee. We're taking all of that feedback very seriously, and we are making changes to our processes each and every cycle. So as we practice continuous learning, you'll notice minor changes in our processes, our practices, our application forms. We've really tried to shorten what we're asking nonprofits to do so that you can spend time doing the work in community. And so, for example, what is needed to make a funding decision, the bare minimum, and making sure that the application forms are short. In terms of reporting, what is needed to close out a grant, and what is the learning that took place, not so much focused on the outputs and the outcomes, but really what does success look like for that particular grant, and how was there an impact in community? And we're really interested in what you're learning. We're not as much concerned with, oh, this didn't go as planned, or we didn't quite get the numbers we anticipated. That's less important. And what's more important is the learning and the impact that's happening at the community level. And so we've even shifted some of those reports to conversations in order to have a deeper dialogue about the work and not be so focused on the paperwork aspect. So I wanted to make sure I lifted those few things up, but I know we're so close on time here. Anna, Dree, Shamika, how can we lift up any other pieces of our work?
I think I spoke to some of the things the initiatives are doing earlier, and so I don't really want to have much to add to that. I will say that with BPI in particular, when they were starting their Impact Grants program, I think the volunteer committee really was looking for ways to reach more smaller Black-led boots on the ground organizations that were in community, but may not have had, that are traditionally left out of traditional grant making opportunities, or may not think that they could apply for a grant. And so I think the Impact Grants was a way to draw more kind of organizations to the foundation to then apply for other larger grant opportunities and support them along that way. And then just to add additional to what April was already saying as far as continuous learning, I think we've also with the Women's Fund and BPI implemented changes as far as grant reporting. And so we offer the opportunity to just have a phone call, or you can do a report if that's easier for you. It's really, again, just trying to gain information on what you've learned, the impact that was specific to your program. And yeah, I don't think, Dree, April, is there anything else that I might have?
Something else that's just, I want to also lift up, and Chanel, please chime in on this as well. One of the big things that the foundation is trying to also do within respect to grant making that might involve other partners in the community, for example, capital grant making and the campaign coordinating committee. I just want to lift up that you might remember, for decades, there was this community group that was scheduling these large scale fundraisers. And as the foundation was a member of this group, it wasn't our work that we were leading solely. It was like a partnership with others from the community. And we really tried to pause and push back on that process and dismantle it a little bit and try to understand, is this serving what, while it might have accomplished a lot years ago, is it serving what we need today? And how can we ask questions in a way of both donors and nonprofits around large scale fundraisers and capital improvement grants? And so because we tried to slow down and engage and get feedback from the nonprofit community, we were able to make some changes in that respect. And so now the foundation, as a result of that, is going to make changes to our capital grant making. So in the past, we were limited to funding organizations on this community calendar. And we realized that that was leaving out a lot of nonprofits, especially, smaller nonprofits, BIPOC-led nonprofits. And so now that there's not this calendar that's only, 3 to 4 organizations per year, we're able to open up that funding opportunity to all nonprofits and to really just take a step back and try to meet the needs, the capital improvement needs of nonprofits in a new way. And so that might not have happened if we didn't have some hard conversations around the table with our partners and colleagues in this work. And so just want to also lift that up as another example of maybe how we're trying to show up differently. And while it's not perfect, it is something that we're leaning into and making those changes.
I'll just jump in and share. I know Asset Funders Network, we're a little bit different since we're a philanthropy membership organization, but I did want to lift up a few concrete examples. And the first being within our Realizing Economic Justice work, there are 4 components. One is around our equity amplifier, where our funder members have the opportunity to amplify the work that organizations who are led by and serving in communities of color can lift up the work that they're doing. And our goal is to really work in partnership with funders to where they can leverage our platform to amplify the work that those organizations are doing. And so while we are a PSO, a philanthropy support organization, we're creating more prominent space for nonprofits and organizations who are doing the work that we're talking about, with the goal that other funders can learn about the work that they're doing. There was a comment about sometimes funders fund who they know. And so this is our way to offer our platform that can be leveraged. We also have our Equity Amplified directory where funders can, again, if there are organizations of color who are focused specifically around asset building, that could be another platform so that other funders can learn about the work that they're doing. Another thing that's unique, I think, with AFN is that we have a number of programming that we offer, and is open to practitioners and nonprofits as well. So while we do have funder-only programming, a lot of our programming is open to nonprofits. And so that's another way where, as we think about capacity building, as we think about including diverse perspectives in our work, we want to be intentional about making sure that there's access for that. And so the last example I'll just share is there's some regional chapters who have set it up to where nonprofit organizations are a part of their funder table. And so collaboration looks very differently, and funders have built that into their overall membership cost so that nonprofits don't have to pay an extra fee to participate in that. So we're open in terms of where there's interest in what works best at the regional level for funders. But those are some of the concrete ways that we're doing things differently. We are working in collaboration to build out a funder guide, because we're seeing that a lot of funders are having this conversation and want to learn from each other. And so we also convene funders to continue to not just talk about it, but then what are the explicit actions that will not only impact culture of philanthropy, would actually allow us to show up differently. So those are some of the concrete resources that we're doing with Asset Funders Network.
Thank you so much. I'm looking at the time, but I don't want to cut off any other philanthropists who may want to add just 1 or 2 second comment within this section. If anything, so I'm merging any other emerging thoughts with this section, if there's anything else that comes up for a philanthropist.
I think the one thing, and I tried to kind of type it so it would make sense, but hopefully it did. But, I think a couple of things, we are still learning, and philanthropy is committed to listening. But I think in terms of, when we talk about how do we remove competition? Well, we know we can't remove competition, but one thing philanthropy is really good at is throwing a stake in the middle of the street and telling people to come fight for it. And so if people don't have the resources, so if you've got someone who they've got directors of resource development, which means they have all this language to make their application seem, really, really good. And then we've got other organizations that maybe they don't even know that the stake is in the middle of the street until the day before the application, because they're not on newsletters. Those are some of the things that we're really trying to have conversations about. How do we get the word out about our grants? How are we increasing our networks? How are we taking the onus off of our BIPOC grassroots organizations to even know who we are and where funds might be available? I think these types of conversations help us to be able to do that, and also just really being able to walk through and explain our process, who we are, how do we provide grants at KBR versus how grants are being provided at the Winston Salem Foundation, and being able to describe the difference between, our funding opportunities. Our grants are now 5 questions, but in those 5 questions, we've got to be able to articulate everything that a trustee may need to be understand about a particular proposal. And the other thing I wanted to talk about is when we pull together coalitions, one of the things that we are hoping will happen is through one application, that there has to be some trust among people in the community. So we've got 6 or 7 organizations working on one common goal. The question is, if I've got a large institution coming to me asking for $500,000, you don't have any grassroots institutions at your work, you don't have any nonprofits, we're not continuing the conversation. Like the conversation then becomes, how do you talk about serving community when this does not involve community? And I can tell you that over the last 2 years, we have had the opportunity to say to a lot of institutions who've received funding from KBR for, I'm not going to say perpetuity, but for a long time will be the word that I use. They received a lot of funding, that we've been able to help them understand that in order for you to continue to get funding, your application has to look different. You can't tell me you're working with community without naming the community partners. You can't tell me that you're working with a grassroots organization, but you have not included funding for this grassroots organization to do their work in the application. And so now those applications look like, in the actual funding request, we are requesting $500,000. 120 goes to this organization, 90 goes to us. We're also working with this for-profit organization who's helping us get to the work. And all of those entities are named and they are all coming to the table and everybody gets paid to do the work. It's different, sometimes it's messy. It doesn't always go as planned once the check gets out, and then we have to go back and sit down and have some more conversations. But that's how we get to equity and ensuring that everybody is at the table.
Thank you. I'm going to go ahead and pass it to Magali. I know that you had a clarifying question in the chat, and maybe we can just lift up Paula's question, even if we can't address it today. If it's not, I know Caitlin already addressed the data portion part. Magali, do you want to take a few minutes just to kind of field any clarifying questions before I hop in with the next steps?
I'm not sure what clarifying question I may have had in chat. I forgot. I would have to scroll back, but I think my clarifying questions was addressed, and I made a comment as far as the things that I think I'm unclear on, how I would want to move forward and finding out more later. But are there any questions from Tanya, Frankie, Paula, Bill? Am I forgetting anyone? Ethan, that you need from a clarity standpoint that any of the funders spoke to before we move into the final portion of today's meeting, that you just need absolute clarity on, not comments, just questions. And if not, Joy, I think you can move right into the next section for our last 10 minutes.
Okay, I will do that then. Thank you all again. And when I say you all, it's not just the philanthropist who came showing up to share so much of the process that you all are going through and some of the thoughts that you have, but then also for the leaders in our community who wanted to come, our EDs who wanted to come and be able to be a part. So I just saw Paula's question. Actually, that is a part of the next step. So this is good. So your question has to do with funding impact. This is Paula's question, through a racial equity lens and consider solutions for systemic change. So the next steps that, in full transparency, so Tanya, Magali, and myself have kind of really shaped this part of, and when I say this part, the BIPOC group, back in May, we were about 8 or 9 different organizations, and it just kind of networked to whoever wanted to come and be a part of it. And so the email list grew to about 40 to 60 BIPOC leaders with various inputs of interaction through email or in-person meetings. We had it monthly on the 3rd Friday of each month. When we got to listing out what do we want to focus on as a group of BIPOC leaders who wanted to change the economy that you all have already spoke to about, where most of the dollars are going to white-led organizations or money having to be funneled through white-led organizations. How do we address some of the capacity issues that are present, such as, do you have the time to fill out the 501c3 paperwork, or do you have the time to write this grant? So many of those topics included grant writing, but it also included, like I mentioned to you, an internal process of looking at how do we show up in the communities, holding funders and external partners accountable to what they say what they want to do. And so from that conversation, this funder education came out to be. We also had topics around oppression, not just looking at trauma and racial trauma, but looking at just oppressive factors. And so there were many different topics that we listed as leaders that we wanted to address, including the name change. We wanted to also to have a meeting to find a name that was so BIPOC stands for Black, Indigenous, People of Color. We wanted to find a name that was representative of the ethnicities and the identities that actually showed up into the space. And many of us didn't feel like BIPOC was a very good representative name for our identities. So we wanted to reflect the diversity and also the impact of having a funding disparity, because the funding, even though we're talking about BIPOC and we group it all together, this racial construct wants us to look at generalizations and not really look at individuals as humans and as separate identities. But when we look at and when we segment the impact of the funding disparity, it actually impacts different ethnic groups differently and different communities within those ethnic groups differently. And so this group wanted to lift up that difference and really figure out, how do we address that? Some of what I would like to do, if we have time, is just get a general, and we've heard from some of you already in the chat or vocally, just about what you have heard so far in the session. I know for the BIPOC leaders, Tanya Magali and myself, when we were actually looking at all the different paperwork in preparation for this meeting, we wanted to have a next step. And a next step that we had thought about, that we don't know if everyone wants to be involved with, is to spend some time in April recruiting at least 3 philanthropists and 3 BIPOC, I'm using BIPOC just for the continuity of language, and 3 BIPOC organizations who would want to really go much deeper into these conversations and into what some of you have already mentioned already as this journey. It is a journey, and we can't hold people accountable for the process that you take on this journey, because it's individual, it's individualized. And I don't think it's fair for us to rush an individual process. And in that, the challenge though, is that as we go, as organizations and individuals within that organization go through their own journey of racial equity or learning about it, we also know that there are many lives that are affected in the process. Deaths are still occurring, and morbidity still takes place. And so what do we do in this interim time as organizations examining their policies, their structures, but we still have this little bit of hardship that people are experiencing in the real day-to-day. And so our next step is thinking, can we convene together sometime in May where we can have a deeper process, and where 3 philanthropist groups and at least 3 BIPOC organizations come together to really start to map out, how do we define what collaboration looks like, what challenges are, what capacity building, because I think some of the assumptions is that small organizations need capacity building around how to develop a budget or how to run a program, when really, when you look at it, it's truly a funding issue. It's not, oh, I need to know how to write a grant, because I may already have that skill. It's, I actually just need money to run my program. I don't need another grant put before me. I need to be able to get access to the actual resource. And so this process in May that we're proposing is, how do we really define these terms, and so that we can put strategic measures and strategic plans in place that are in collaboration with each other to help change the fabric and keep philanthropy and keep community groups in conversation as a we and not as an us and them. We are really aiming to be a we in this common solution finding process. And I also just want to name the tension that is often felt by wanting to be or being in the structure and also wanting to change it. So many of the philanthropists that we see now you look very different than what philanthropy looked like 40, 50 years ago. Many of the philanthropists and program officers were white men. Many of you do not fit that profile. And so I want to honor the challenge that has already taken place and what people have already done to get us to this point, and to name that. And we don't want to assume that what you're doing is enough, what you're doing is inclusive, and what you're doing is the only thing that can be done. That's not to say that there is not a lot of many hours and a lot of tears already being shed and a lot of thought being taking place to change what it is that we can move. So I will pause there and just kind of get some general one words you can put in the chat, or you can just say like 1 or 3 words about like, yes, I'm interested in learning more. We don't want a full commitment. We just wanted to share and lift up, you know, what this is. And Paula's question, thank you, Shamika, for highlighting that. Paula's question would be best housed in that conversation where we can really tease out a deeper process. So what are some initial thoughts or feelings or comments? And again, use the chat.
And while you're putting those 1 to 3 words in the chat, I just want to comment on the link that I just put in the chat. You all are in this field already, so you may have already seen this document, but we wanted to share it in case you haven't. I am imploring you that you open the link or copy and paste it so you have access to it later. It's one of the things that, to me, you know, when it was brought to our group, that we really see some of the trends as we think about philanthropy and how we're changing it. Again, I don't need to talk to y'all about it. This is your field, you know it better than me, but just wanted to share it as a resource in case you haven't seen that document, you haven't seen that report in this space. Joy, we are exactly at 1 minute left. So I don't know if you want to give any closing words. We do want to be respectful of everybody's time today. So.
Yeah, did anyone have a 1 word or that you wanted to put in the chat? Well, if not, I want to say thank you again for joining. Thank you for your honesty, your transparency, and we would follow up, and we look forward to listening and being in partnership as the time moves forward. So with that, thank you for your courage. Yes, Michael, solidarity over unity. Yes, thank you, Tania. Thank you, Caitlin. Thank you, Magali. Yeah, bye, April. Bye, Anna. Bye, Andrea. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Velvet.
Joy, did you want to go?